You were fine until about 2 p.m. That's the part nobody talks about. Not the dramatic failures, the blown relationships, the financial disasters, the words said in anger that couldn't be unsaid. Those get examined. Those get therapy and journaling and long conversations with people who love you. Nobody examines the 2 p.m. version of you, the one who answered an email slightly too sharply, who made a purchase that wasn't catastrophic, but wasn't quite right either, who let a thought run for 40 minutes before noticing where it had gone, who walked into a conversation already carrying something from 3 hours ago and took it out on someone who had nothing to do with it. That version of you is responsible for more of your life than you think. There's a specific moment I keep coming back to. I was in a conversation I'd been in 100 times. Different person, same dynamic. And I knew, while it was happening, exactly what I was doing wrong. I could see it clearly. I did it anyway. And afterward, I sat with the particular exhaustion of someone who understood the problem completely and changed nothing about it. That's a different kind of tired than not knowing. Worse in some ways. That gap between understanding and actually doing differently is what this book is about. Not in a motivational sense, in a mechanical one. Because the 4 things that run your life, your mouth, your mind, your mood, your money, don't fail randomly. They fail in sequence, at predictable times, for reasons that are entirely understandable once you see the architecture underneath them. The sharp word at 9 p.m. The financial decision made from anxiety rather than intention. The thought spiral that started from nothing and arrived somewhere it had no business going. These aren't character flaws. They're systems operating without oversight. You've been managing the symptoms. This is about the systems. The approach here is not inspirational. It doesn't ask you to want it more, to find your why, to become someone fundamentally different than you are. It asks something smaller and considerably harder, that you pay attention to what's actually happening in the specific moments when these 4 things go wrong, and learn to intervene before the damage is done. By the time you finish, the 2 p.m. version of you will be running different software. Not perfect software, better software. That's enough. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I read every single one. It's always interesting to see where this reaches. Chapter 1. The muscle you've been starving. You didn't lack discipline at 11 p.m. You used it all up by 2 p.m. This is not a metaphor. It's closer to physiology. The research on this is uncomfortable enough that most productivity culture quietly ignores it. Because if people understood it fully, they'd stop buying planners and start redesigning their afternoons. Here's what's actually happening. Every decision you make draws from the same cognitive resource. Doesn't matter if the decision is important. Doesn't matter if it's trivial. Your brain doesn't distinguish between choosing a health insurance plan and choosing what to eat for lunch. Both cost something. Both leave you with slightly less than you started with. Psychologists call this ego depletion. You can argue about the exact mechanism, and academics do, loudly. But the behavioral pattern is hard to dispute. The person who handles a difficult conversation at 9 a.m., navigates a frustrating meeting at 11, skips lunch to meet a deadline, and fields 3 urgent emails by 3 p.m. That person is not going to make a great decision at 9 p.m. They're going to eat something they didn't plan to eat, say something they didn't mean to say, buy something they don't need, and scroll for an hour they didn't intend to spend. Not because they're weak, because they're empty. A man I knew ran a tight ship every morning. Gym at 6, emails handled by 9, focused work until noon. By 7 p.m., he was a different person entirely. Irritable, impulsive, spending money on things that would embarrass him sober. He thought he had a willpower problem. He had a resource management problem. Different diagnosis, different fix. This is the first thing to understand about self-control. It isn't a character trait. It's a system. And like any system, it can be designed well or designed poorly. Most people design it poorly by accident, then blame themselves for the output. The second thing to understand is that fighting impulses directly is almost always the wrong strategy. Picture someone trying to not think about a cigarette. Really trying. Clenching their jaw, white-knuckling through the craving, running internal arguments about cancer statistics. Every second of that effort costs something. Every second of resistance depletes the same resource they'll need later to not send the angry text, to not impulse buy the thing, to not eat the entire bag. Brute force is expensive, and it's not even that effective. True self-control, the kind that actually holds under pressure, doesn't work by fighting. It works by designing. You change what's visible. You change what's easy. You change the sequence of your day so the important decisions happen when you're sharp, and the trivial ones either disappear or don't require thought at all. Steve Jobs wore the same thing every day. Not because he had no taste, because he understood that choosing an outfit was a withdrawal from an account he'd rather spend elsewhere. That's not eccentricity. That's applied cognitive economics. The 4 pillars, mouth, mind, mood, money, all run on this same depleting resource, which means they fail in sequence. Your mouth goes first, usually. Something sharp comes out that you didn't quite intend. Then your mind follows, the negative spiral starts, and you don't catch it fast enough. The mood drops. And somewhere in that fog, a financial decision gets made that the morning version of you would not have approved. You've felt this. Everyone has. The question is whether you've ever looked at it as a system failure rather than a personal one. I have skipped meals on high decision days and paid for it in ways that had nothing to do with hunger. The correlation between my worst arguments and my most depleted afternoons is embarrassing in hindsight. I thought I was reacting to the situation. I was reacting to my own empty tank. So what do you do with this? You stop scheduling hard things at the wrong time. You stop leaving important conversations for evenings when you're already spent. You stop making financial decisions when you're tired, hungry, or emotionally activated. These aren't signs of weakness. They're inputs. You account for them. You also build what actually works. Habits, not decisions. A habit doesn't cost what a decision costs. When a behavior becomes automatic, it runs on a different track entirely. You're not choosing to do it. You're just doing it. This is why routines protect you. They reduce the number of live decisions your day requires, which preserves resources for the moments that actually matter. The goal is to convert as many good behaviors as possible into non-decisions. You don't decide to brush your teeth. You don't decide to put on a seatbelt. These are free, zero cost. They don't touch the tank. The person who has turned their morning exercise into a non-decision, their healthy lunch into a non-decision, their savings transfer into a non-decision. That person has more left over at 9 p.m. than the person making all of those calls fresh every day. That's not discipline in the motivational sense. That's architecture. Build the right structure and good behavior becomes the path of least resistance. Don't build it, and you'll spend your life fighting yourself, and losing predictably at predictable times, wondering why you keep ending up in the same place. You're not broken. You're just running a system no one ever showed you how to design. That changes now. Chapter 2. Your mouth is writing checks your life has to cash. The sentence that destroyed the relationship took 4 seconds to say and 3 years to mean anything. Not because it was untrue, because it was true and said at the wrong moment, in the wrong tone, with the wrong amount of anger behind it. And once it was out, it couldn't be retrieved. It just sat there in the room, doing damage quietly for months, until the relationship finally collapsed under the accumulated weight of things said badly at the wrong time. Words don't disappear, they compound. Most people treat speech like breathing, automatic, continuous, not something that requires management. They say what they think as they think it, react to what they feel as they feel it, and then wonder why their relationships have a ceiling, why the promotion keeps going to someone else, why the same argument keeps happening with different people wearing different faces. Your mouth is not a neutral instrument. It's a precision tool you've been swinging like a hammer. Here's the mechanism. Between something happening and you speaking about it, there is a gap. It's small, sometimes less than a second, but it exists. In that gap, a choice is available. Most people never take it. They've spent decades collapsing that gap until it's essentially invisible, training themselves to respond as fast as possible, as if speed were a virtue in conversation. It isn't. Speed in conversation is almost always anxiety in disguise. The pause, a real one, deliberate, slightly uncomfortable, is where your mouth control actually lives. Not in some elaborate communication framework, not in scripts or strategies. In the pause. 3 seconds, sometimes less. Enough time for the reactive version of you to stand down and the intentional version to show up. This is harder than it sounds, because silence feels like losing, especially in conflict. The instinct is to fill every gap, to keep talking, to make sure your point lands, to defend, to explain, to get there first. That instinct is almost always wrong. The person who speaks second, calmly, after a visible pause, almost always has more authority in the room than the person who fired first. I watched a manager lose his entire team's respect in one sentence. Not a cruel sentence, just an unfiltered one. The kind you say when you're frustrated and the gap has collapsed and you forget that other people are permanent and moments are not. He never recovered the room. The sentence took 3 seconds. The damage took 3 years. There's a second mouth most people ignore entirely. Your internal monologue. The running commentary that never stops. The voice that narrates your performance, predicts outcomes, assigns meaning to other people's behavior, and delivers verdicts about your own worth with the confidence of someone who has access to facts they definitely don't have. This voice is not neutral either, and it matters more than what you say out loud, because it shapes what you're capable of saying. If the internal voice is running a constant loop of "you're not good enough," you'll never pull this off. They don't respect you. That loop will leak into your tone, into your word choice, into the defensiveness that other people feel without being able to name. You can't fully separate what you say from what you believe you are. Most people's self-talk would constitute a hostile work environment if said out loud to another person. The level of criticism, the certainty of failure, the casual cruelty of the internal verdict, it would be remarkable if directed outward. Directed inward, it just runs on a loop and gets called realistic. It isn't realistic. it's habitual. Those are different things. Changing the internal voice doesn't mean replacing it with relentless positivity. That's just lying to yourself with enthusiasm. It means becoming a more accurate narrator. Not, "I'm terrible at this," which is a verdict, but "I haven't figured this out yet," which is a position. One closes the case, the other leaves it open. The distinction sounds small. The behavioral difference is enormous. There's a third dimension to mouth control that doesn't get enough attention: what you choose to engage with at all. Not every provocation requires a response. Not every slight needs addressing. Not every wrong opinion in a room needs your correction. The people who seem most authoritative in any group are rarely the ones talking most. They're the ones who have learned to be selective, who understand that speaking into every situation dilutes the impact of speaking into the important ones. Choosing silence is not passivity, it's editorial judgment. The same principle applies to gossip, complaint, and what might charitably be called processing out loud. These conversations feel like release. They're actually debt. Every time you spend 20 minutes detailing someone else's failures to a third party who wasn't there, you've made a small withdrawal from your own credibility, your own energy, and the relationship you're supposedly venting to. The relief is real. The cost is just invisible until it isn't. There's also the question of what you promise. Casual commitments are where a lot of quiet damage happens. The "I'll call you, I'll look into that," "we should definitely," said with genuine intention in the moment, forgotten by the following Tuesday. Each one lands as a small data point in someone else's mental model of you. Accumulated over time, they form a picture. It's not usually the picture you'd choose. Your word, extended often enough without follow-through, stops meaning what you need it to mean. So the practice here is not complicated. It's just uncomfortable. Pause before you speak, especially when you don't want to. Clean up the internal monologue, not by silencing it, but by making it more honest. Choose your engagements deliberately and say less than you think you need to say, because you almost always think you need to say more than you do. The people who communicate with the most impact are not the most eloquent. They're the most selective. Every word you don't say carelessly is available for when it actually counts. You're still here. 2 chapters in, that's not nothing. Most people who clicked this video moved on before they got uncomfortable. You didn't. Which means something in here is hitting close enough to stay. If that's the case, subscribe. Not because this channel needs it, because the next time you want this kind of thinking, you'll want to find it without looking for it. That's all. Back to the part that actually matters. Chapter 3. The mind is not on your side. Your brain is not trying to make you happy. It's trying to keep you alive. And it's hilariously bad at telling the difference. The same neural architecture that kept your ancestors scanning for predators is now scanning your inbox, your social media feed, your co-worker's tone of voice in a Tuesday meeting. The threat detection system didn't get a memo that the predators are mostly gone. It just kept running, kept flagging, kept generating worst-case scenarios with the same urgency it would apply to an actual emergency. This is not a malfunction. It's the system working exactly as designed. The design is just about 40,000 years out of date. Understanding this one thing, that your mind's negativity bias is ancestral, not personal, should change how you relate to your own thinking. The dark spiral isn't a character flaw. It's a feature running in the wrong environment. You didn't install it, but you are responsible for what you do with it. Here's what most people do with it. Nothing. They let it run. A thought arrives. Something went wrong. Someone might be angry. This could fail. And the untrained mind treats it as a report from reality, as information to be acted on. It follows the thought wherever it leads, down through escalating scenarios, past evidence, straight into conclusion. By the time it's done, a mildly awkward email has become evidence of professional incompetence and a preview of eventual ruin. The thought felt like logic. It wasn't logic. It was momentum. The critical distinction, the one that separates people who manage their minds from people who are managed by them, is this. A thought is not a fact. It is a neurological event. Something the brain produced, not something the world delivered. You are not your thoughts. You are the thing that notices them. This sounds like the kind of sentence that gets printed on a wellness app between a sunrise photo and a breathing exercise. It isn't. It's a structural claim about cognition. When you can observe a thought rather than automatically inhabit it, you create the space to evaluate it, to ask whether it's accurate, to decide whether to follow it or let it pass. Psychologists call this metacognition, thinking about thinking. It sounds abstract until you try it once and realize you've been in a bad mood for 3 hours because of a thought you never once questioned. A colleague of mine spent 2 weeks convinced she was about to be fired. The evidence: her manager had been quieter than usual in meetings. She'd constructed an entire narrative, performance issues, backroom conversations, a timeline to her termination, from silence. The manager was dealing with a personal crisis that had nothing to do with her. My colleague lost 2 weeks of focus, confidence, and sleep to a story her mind wrote without her permission. She's not unusual. She's everyone. The cognitive patterns that most reliably hijack your thinking have names. Catastrophizing, assuming the worst outcome is the likely one. Personalizing, assuming other people's behavior is about you when it usually isn't. Black and white thinking, everything is either fine or ruined, with no spectrum between. Mind reading, deciding you know what someone else is thinking, then reacting to the version of them you invented. These aren't rare disorders. They're default settings, running quietly in the background, shaping your interpretation of everything that happens to you, making the neutral seem threatening and the uncertain seem doomed. The fix is not positive thinking. Positive thinking applied to distorted negative thinking is just two inaccuracies fighting each other. The fix is accurate thinking, which is slower, less satisfying, and significantly more useful. When you catch a thought that's pulling you somewhere dark, you ask it to show its work. What's the actual evidence here? Not the feeling, the evidence. What's the most realistic interpretation of this situation? Not the most dramatic one. What would I tell a friend who came to me with this exact thought? That last question is quietly devastating. Because most people are far more rational, generous, and accurate when thinking about someone else's situation than their own. The same person who would talk a friend down from a catastrophic interpretation in 10 minutes will spend 3 days inhabiting that interpretation themselves without question. You already have the reasoning capacity. You're just not applying it to yourself. There's another dimension here that doesn't get enough credit, where you direct your attention. The mind doesn't run on content alone. It runs on direction. An undirected mind doesn't rest, it wanders. And wandering minds, left to their own defaults, do not wander toward gratitude and possibility. They wander toward unresolved threat, toward past regret and future risk. toward the social slight from last Thursday and the presentation due in 3 weeks. This is why vague days feel worse than busy ones. It's not the absence of stimulation, it's the absence of direction. Giving your mind a clear problem to solve, a real one, specific with actual stakes, is one of the most effective mood interventions available. Not because the problem gets solved immediately, because a directed mind is a calmer mind. It has somewhere to go. It stops scanning. I went through a period where I'd wake up anxious without knowing why. Then I started writing down one specific question I wanted to think about that day. Not a goal, just a question. The anxiety didn't disappear, but it had somewhere to go. Ambient dread is just undirected cognitive energy looking for a target. Give it a target, and it becomes something more useful. The morning mental routine, whatever form it takes, is really just a targeting system. You're telling your mind where to point before the day does it for you, before the inbox decides your priorities, before someone else's urgency becomes your emotional weather. 10 minutes, a direction. That's the whole intervention. None of this means eliminating negative thought. That's not possible, and not the goal. The goal is to reduce the lag time between a thought arriving and you recognizing it for what it is. To shorten the window in which an unexamined thought can do damage. With practice, that window gets smaller. The spiral still starts. You just catch it earlier, before it has built enough momentum to feel like truth. Your mind is extraordinary at solving problems you give it clearly. It is terrible at being left alone. Stop leaving it alone. Chapter 4. Whether you made yourself. She walked into the meeting already angry at something that hadn't happened yet, not consciously. She didn't know she was doing it. But somewhere between the difficult commute and the cold coffee and the email she'd read while still half asleep, a mood had assembled itself without her input, and now it was running the meeting. Every comment landed slightly wrong. Every question felt like a challenge. The meeting wasn't difficult. She was difficult, and she had no idea because she wasn't the one experiencing her face. This is how most bad days actually work. Not a series of genuinely terrible events. A mood that arrived uninvited, went unexamined, and then filtered every subsequent experience through its particular shade of gray. The events were neutral. The mood was the variable. And because the mood felt like a response to the day, rather than a cause of it, nobody, least of all her, thought to question it. Mood feels like weather. Something that happens to you. Something you check and then navigate around. The way you'd check a forecast before leaving the house. Most people treat their emotional state the way they treat actual weather, as a given, as context, as the condition under which life is happening, rather than something they had any hand in creating. But you made most of it. Not all of it, but more than you think. Here's the mechanism that nobody explains clearly enough. Your mood at any given moment is largely produced by 3 inputs running simultaneously. Your physiology, what your body is doing, your focus, what you're paying attention to, and your language, the words you're using internally and externally to describe your situation. Change any one of these and your mood shifts. Change all 3 and you can move yourself from genuinely miserable to functionally capable in under 5 minutes. This sounds like a claim that should require more evidence. Try it once and it won't. The physiology piece is the most underestimated. Your brain doesn't just send signals to your body sends signals back. Constantly. Your posture, your breathing, your facial expression, your movement. These aren't just outputs of your emotional state, they're inputs to it. The feedback loop runs both directions. Slouch long enough, and your brain starts receiving messages consistent with defeat. Breathe shallowly for 20 minutes, and your nervous system interprets it as threat. Frown at nothing in particular, and your mood will drift toward whatever emotional state your brain associates with that expression. The reverse is also true. Stand up straight, and something shifts. Take 5 slow, full breaths, and your nervous system recalibrates. Move your body, not because you want to, but before you want to, and the wanting often follows. The emotion doesn't arrive first and then change the body. Sometimes the body moves first and the emotion catches up. Athletes have known this for decades. The pre-performance ritual isn't superstition, it's physiology management. You're not waiting to feel ready. You're generating the state that makes readiness possible. Focus is the second lever, and it's the most immediately actionable. Whatever you focus on expands. Not metaphorically, neurologically. Your brain filters incoming information through a system called the reticular activating system, which essentially screens reality for whatever you've told it matters. If you're focused on what's wrong, you will find evidence of wrongness everywhere, in abundance, in detail, with remarkable consistency. Not because things are especially wrong, because you've tuned the filter. The person who wakes up and immediately catalogs everything that's difficult about the day ahead will have a more difficult day than the person who wakes up and finds 3 things that are working. Same day, different filter, dramatically different experience. This is not toxic positivity. It's not pretending problems don't exist. It's understanding that your attention is a finite resource and that where you point it shapes what your reality actually feels like from the inside. You can acknowledge a problem fully and still choose not to marinate in it. The language piece is subtler and more powerful than most people expect. The words you use to describe your emotional experience don't just label it, they intensify or diminish it. If you tell yourself this is a disaster, your nervous system responds to disaster. If you tell yourself this is challenging, your nervous system responds to challenge. Same situation. Completely different physiological and psychological response, triggered entirely by the word you chose. I noticed I was using the word overwhelmed for situations that were, on reflection, merely busy. The word was doing work I hadn't authorized. Every time I said it, even internally, it generated a physical response consistent with overwhelm. When I replaced it with full, something small but real shifted. The situation didn't change. The experience of it did. Language is not decoration. It's architecture. Now. None of this means manufacturing cheerfulness you don't feel. Forced positivity is its own kind of problem. It layers a performance on top of an unprocessed emotion and calls it management. That's not management. That's suppression with better branding. Real mood management means something different. It means developing the ability to experience an emotion without being operated by it. To feel frustrated without making a frustrated decision. To feel anxious without treating the anxiety as reliable information about the future. To feel disappointed without building a worldview around the disappointment. The emotion is real. The story you attach to it is optional. There's also the question of emotional contagion, something most people dramatically underestimate. Emotions are not private. They move between people like temperature. You walk into a room where someone is quietly furious, and you feel it before anyone says a word. You spend 40 minutes with someone who is genuinely calm, and you leave the conversation slightly more settled than you arrived. You are constantly absorbing the emotional states of the people around you, and they are constantly absorbing yours. This means your mood is not a personal matter. It's an environmental one. The state you carry into a room is the state you're introducing into that room. Which means mood management is not just self-care. It's a form of responsibility to the people who have to share space with you. The meeting she walked into, already angry. Everyone in that room paid a small tax for a mood she didn't know she was carrying. Nobody said anything. Nobody needed to. They all just left slightly more depleted than they arrived, without being able to say exactly why. Your emotional state is always someone else's weather. Manage it accordingly. Chapter 5. Money goes where your psychology sends it. He wasn't bad with money. He was bad with anxiety. And money was just where that showed up. Every time work got difficult, he bought something. Not extravagantly, just consistently. A gadget, a course he wouldn't finish. Dinner at a place slightly beyond his budget. Nothing catastrophic in isolation. Accumulated over 12 months, it was $11,000. He couldn't account for, and a vague sense that something was wrong with him, financially, as a person. Nothing was wrong with him financially. Something was wrong with how he'd learned to manage discomfort. The money was downstream of that. This is the thing about financial behavior that purely logical approaches to personal finance never quite reach. Money problems are almost never really about money. They're about what money represents, which is different for every person, shaped by experiences most people have never examined, running on autopilot since childhood. For some people, money means security. The absence of it triggers a fear response that has nothing to do with current circumstances and everything to do with watching a parent count change at the grocery store 30 years ago. For others, it means freedom, and spending it feels like exercising power, like proof that the scarcity is over, even when it isn't. For others, it's status, identity, evidence of worth. For others, it's danger, something that corrupts, that creates problems, that makes people treat you differently. You probably have a relationship with money that was largely written before you were 12, and you've probably never read it. The first step isn't budgeting. The first step is diagnosis. What did money mean in the house you grew up in? Was it discussed openly or treated like a shameful secret? Was there enough? Or was there a permanent low hum of scarcity? Did the adults around you fight about it, hide from it, worship it, resent the people who had it? Every one of those experiences deposited something into your financial blueprint. And your financial blueprint is running right now, underneath every money decision you think you're making rationally. There are patterns worth knowing. The spender finds genuine emotional relief in purchasing. The transaction itself is the reward. The anticipation, the acquisition, the brief spike of dopamine before the object becomes just another object in the room. Spending isn't irresponsibility for the spender. It's self-medication. The budget fails not because the math is wrong, but because the emotional need it was supposed to replace is still unmet. The saver accumulates, but can't deploy. Money in the account feels like safety. Spending it, even on things that would genuinely improve their life, even on investments that would grow it, triggers something that feels uncomfortably close to loss. The saver often looks financially responsible from the outside, while quietly being paralyzed by scarcity, thinking in a situation that no longer warrants it. The avoider simply doesn't look. Bills stack up unopened. Accounts go unchecked. Financial decisions get postponed until they become crises, which then confirm the belief that money is overwhelming and best not thought about. The avoidance is not laziness. It's a phobia wearing laziness as a disguise. The worrier checks constantly, runs the numbers repeatedly, plans for scenarios that have a 3% chance of occurring, knows their balance to the dollar, and still feels financially unsafe. The worry is not about information. They have plenty of information. It's about the absence of a feeling that more information was never going to provide. Most people are a combination of 2 or 3 of these. None of them are fixed. All of them are addressable once you can see them clearly. Now, the practical framework. The 50-30-20 rule is a starting point, not a doctrine. 50% of after-tax income to needs, housing, food, transportation, minimum debt payments. 30% to wants, the things that make life worth living, not the things that make anxiety temporarily quiet. 20% to savings and debt reduction beyond minimums. The reason most budgets fail isn't mathematical. It's that they're built on restriction without understanding. You can tell someone to stop spending on wants all you like. If those wants are doing emotional work, managing stress, generating identity, filling loneliness, the budget is just a lid on a pressure cooker. Eventually, something gives. The more useful question is, what is this spending actually doing for me? Not in a judgmental way, in a genuinely curious one. Because once you know what need a spending pattern is meeting, you can ask whether there's a less expensive way to meet it. And sometimes there isn't. Sometimes the dinner out with friends is doing real, necessary social and emotional work, and cutting it is a false economy. But sometimes the third streaming service is just inertia, and the daily delivery coffee is a small rebellion against a life that feels slightly out of control. Knowing the difference requires honesty that most budgeting systems don't ask for. The emergency fund is not a financial recommendation. It's a psychological intervention. 3 to 6 months of basic expenses, liquid, not invested, sitting there doing nothing except existing. Its primary function is not financial. It's the elimination of desperation. Desperation makes bad decisions. A person negotiating a job offer from a position of financial security negotiates differently than a person who needs the offer. A person who can absorb an unexpected car repair without panic makes better decisions than a person for whom that repair is a crisis. The fund doesn't just protect your money, it protects your judgment. Compound interest is the one financial concept that actually deserves the reverence it receives. Not because the math is complicated, it isn't, but because the math is so counterintuitive that most people don't believe it until it's either working beautifully for them or against them. The credit card charging 22% interest is compound interest working against you. The index fund returning 7% annually is compound interest working for you. The difference between starting at 25 and starting at 35 is not 10 years. It's often more than the total amount you invest. Starting matters more than amount. Consistency matters more than timing. Both of these facts run directly counter to the instinct to wait until you have more figured out before you begin. I understood compound interest conceptually for years before I actually felt it. Then I looked at a 10-year-old account I'd forgotten I'd set up and done nothing with. Just automatic contributions, unremarkable, and the number was not what I expected. The math had been running quietly the whole time. It does not require your attention. It requires only your participation. Debt is not monolithic. Debt that acquires an asset or builds earning capacity is a different instrument than debt that funds consumption. A mortgage on a property that appreciates is different from a credit card balance at 24% interest. Treating all debt as equally bad leads to poor decisions about which to pay down first. The psychological relief of eliminating a small debt sometimes outweighs the mathematical case for attacking the high-interest one, and sometimes it doesn't. Knowing which situation you're in requires clarity about whether you're managing math or managing motivation. Usually, you're managing both. The deepest money psychology issue, the one underneath all the others, is the conflation of net worth and self-worth. The belief, rarely stated but widely held, that your financial situation is a verdict on your value as a human being. That poverty reflects failure of character and wealth reflects its presence. That your bank balance is a measure of how much you deserve. It isn't. It's a number. It reflects decisions, circumstances, timing, luck, inheritance, financial and psychological, and 1,000 variables that have nothing to do with whether you are a good person or a worthy one. Separating these two things doesn't mean pretending money doesn't matter. It matters enormously. It means making financial decisions from a place of agency rather than shame. Because shame is the worst possible financial advisor. It tells you not to look, not to ask, not to admit where you are, and you can't fix what you won't face. Chapter 6. The part of you that doesn't want to win. You'll sabotage harder the closer you get. That's not a warning. That's a pattern. Watch for it. The promotion is almost certain, and suddenly you're late to 3 meetings in a row. The relationship is the healthiest one you've ever had, and you pick a fight about something so small you can't explain it afterward. The business is gaining traction, and you find 17 urgent reasons to stop working on it. Not reasons you invented consciously. Reasons that arrived fully formed, feeling completely legitimate, demanding immediate attention. The timing is always suspicious. The justifications are always convincing. That's what makes it so hard to see. Self-sabotage is not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive as obvious self-destruction, the missed flight, the blown interview, the public meltdown. More often it looks like procrastination, perfectionism, suddenly getting very busy with the wrong things at exactly the right moment. A low-grade, persistent inability to follow through on the things that matter most, dressed up as circumstance. It feels like bad luck. It's actually bad arithmetic. The kind your unconscious is doing without your knowledge, calculating whether the cost of success is one you're willing to pay. Here's the psychology underneath it. Your identity is not just who you think you are. It's who you've been consistently enough that it feels true. And your unconscious mind is deeply committed to maintaining the consistency of that identity. Not because the identity is good, but because it's known, familiar, predictable. The brain treats identity threat the way it treats physical threat. With resistance, with avoidance, with behavior designed to return things to baseline. If your identity has been built around struggle, around being the person who tries hard but doesn't quite make it, who has potential that never fully arrives, then success isn't just a destination, it's a disruption. A threat to the coherent story your mind has been telling about who you are. And the mind will protect that story. Quietly, persistently, with considerable creativity. A woman I knew had spent 15 years building toward a specific professional goal. She was talented. Everyone who worked with her knew it. When the opportunity finally arrived, the exact opportunity she'd been preparing for, she spent 3 weeks finding reasons it wasn't the right time. the commute, the timing. A vague sense that she wasn't quite ready yet. She turned it down. 6 months later, she understood what had happened. By then, the opportunity had gone somewhere else. She wasn't afraid of failure. She was afraid of arriving. This is the fear of success, one of the most misunderstood psychological phenomena in personal development, possibly because it sounds like a luxury problem. It isn't. Success brings visibility, responsibility, expectations, the possibility of losing what you've gained, the certainty that other people will form opinions. For someone whose identity is built around unrealized potential, success is actually more threatening than failure. Because failure confirms the story, while success dismantles it and offers nothing certain in its place. Perfectionism lives in this same neighborhood. The perfectionist rarely looks like someone who's afraid. They look like someone with very high standards, and they do have high standards. Standards calibrated precisely to be unachievable, which means the work is never quite finished, never quite ready, never quite good enough to release into the world where it could be judged. This is not quality control. It's preemptive self-protection. If you never finish it, no one can tell you it wasn't good enough. The incompletion is painful but controllable. The judgment of a completed thing is painful and isn't. Perfectionism is procrastination with better posture. Imposter syndrome occupies adjacent territory. The belief that your successes are flukes, that the competence others perceive is a performance you've managed to sustain but could collapse at any moment, that you are one close inspection away from being revealed as someone who doesn't belong in the room. The strange thing about imposter syndrome is that it disproportionately affects capable people. The genuinely incompetent rarely worry about being found out. It's the people who know enough to understand the gap between their performance and their ideal, who are actually doing the hard work of growth, who feel most fraudulent. Competence and certainty don't always arrive together. Often, the more you learn, the more aware you become of what you don't know, which feels like regression, but is actually depth. I have delivered presentations to rooms full of people who seemed confident I knew what I was talking about, while internally running a quiet parallel track of concern that this was the moment it would all unravel. The presentations went fine. The internal track ran anyway. It still does sometimes. I've stopped expecting it to stop. The sabotaging mind is loudest just before a breakthrough. This is almost a rule. When you're pushing against the edge of your current identity, the resistance intensifies. More doubts, more distractions, more compelling reasons to stop, wait, reconsider, come back to this later when the conditions are better. The conditions will not be better. The conditions are a story your sabotaging mind is telling you to justify staying where it's comfortable. Recognizing the pattern is the beginning of the intervention, not the end. Recognition alone doesn't dissolve the behavior, but you cannot interrupt something you can't see. Start noticing the timing of your resistance. Notice when you get very busy with irrelevant things. Notice when your standards suddenly escalate on projects that were previously fine. Notice when the most compelling reasons to stop arrive at exactly the moment when continuing would matter most. The pattern is consistent enough that once you've seen it, you'll recognize it every time. It doesn't stop showing up. You just stop being surprised by it. The next layer is the deserving question, and this one is uncomfortable enough that most self-help frameworks skip it entirely. What do you actually believe you deserve? Not what you say you believe. Not what you'd say in a job interview or tell a friend over dinner. What the behavior suggests. Because behavior is a more honest reporter than language. the person who consistently stops short of their goals, who consistently chooses relationships that confirm their worst beliefs about themselves, who consistently makes financial decisions that keep them constrained. That person's behavior is expressing a belief about deserving that their words might never admit to. These beliefs are almost never consciously chosen. They were installed by early experiences, by repeated messages about what people like you achieve, by specific moments of failure or humiliation that got generalized into permanent conclusions. They run below the level of daily awareness, shaping decisions without announcing themselves. Surfacing them requires a specific kind of honesty, not the brutal, self-flagellating kind. That's just the inner critic doing more damage and calling it insight. The honest, curious kind. The kind that asks, if I look at the pattern of my choices over the last 5 years, what would a reasonable observer conclude I believe about what I deserve? Then asking whether that conclusion is actually true, or whether it's just old. The identity upgrade, becoming someone who expects to succeed, who anticipates arrival, who moves through obstacles without treating them as verdicts, doesn't happen through affirmations alone. It happens through accumulated evidence, small commitments made and kept, small wins acknowledged rather than minimized. The gradual construction of a track record that your unconscious mind can eventually accept as proof. You cannot think your way into a new identity. You act your way in, repeatedly, imperfectly, over time. The sabotaging mind will keep showing up, especially when things are going well, especially when success is close enough to feel real. That's not a sign that something is wrong with you. It's a sign that something important is about to happen. Chapter 7. Discipline is not what you think it is. The most disciplined person you know isn't working harder than you. They've just made fewer decisions today. This is the part that ruins the narrative. The narrative is appealing. The 5 a.m. alarm, the cold shower, the iron will, the person who simply wants it more and suffers more gladly in pursuit of it. That narrative sells extremely well. It also describes almost nobody who has actually built lasting discipline in their life. Real discipline is quieter, less cinematic. It looks from the outside almost like ease, and that's exactly what it is. Not the absence of difficulty, but the absence of the daily negotiation that makes difficulty so exhausting. The person who has been running every morning for 4 years doesn't fight themselves out of bed. The decision was made once, a long time ago, and converted into infrastructure. The running happens the way teeth brushing happens, not because they feel like it, not because motivation arrived on schedule, because the question of whether to do it simply doesn't come up anymore. That conversion from decision to non-decision is the actual work of building discipline. Everything else is theater. Here's what most people do instead. They rely on motivation. They wait for the feeling, the surge of intention, the clarity of purpose, the moment when the goal feels vivid and the path feels possible. And motivation is real. It exists. It arrives sometimes with genuine force. The problem is that it's an emotion, which means it follows the rules of all emotions. It comes and goes. It responds to sleep and blood sugar and whether someone was short with you at lunch. And it is categorically unreliable as the primary engine of any behavior you need to sustain over time. Motivation is a weather event. Discipline is plumbing. You need the plumbing. The deepest misunderstanding about discipline is that it requires suffering, that the discomfort is the point, proof of seriousness, evidence of commitment, the price you pay for results. This misunderstanding causes enormous damage because it means people design their disciplines to be as hard as possible, treat ease as cheating, and then fail at unsustainable difficulty and conclude they lack the character for the life they want. They don't lack character. They lack architecture. The actual goal of discipline design is to make the right behavior easy and the wrong behavior inconvenient. To reduce the distance between intention and action until it's small enough that motivation isn't required. To stack the environment, the timing, the sequence of your day in favor of the behavior you're trying to sustain. This is not cheating. This is engineering. The person who wants to exercise more doesn't need more willpower. They need their workout clothes already out the night before, their gym bag already by the door, their morning already structured, so the exercise happens before the day has a chance to fill up with reasons not to. The friction between intention and action has been reduced to almost nothing. The behavior follows almost automatically. Remove the friction. The behavior often takes care of itself. There's a second principle that matters as much as friction reduction. Starting small enough that your brain doesn't resist. Most discipline programs fail in the first 2 weeks because they ask for too much too soon. The person goes from no exercise to a 1-hour workout 6 days a week. From no savings to putting aside 20% of their income. From no reading to a book a week. The ambition is real. The system can't absorb the change. The resistance kicks in, the streak breaks, the shame arrives, and the whole project gets filed under things I've tried that don't work for me. The behavior wasn't wrong. The dosage was wrong. Start with something so small it feels slightly embarrassing. 5 minutes of exercise, 1 page of reading, $5 automatically transferred to savings. The specific amount matters less than the consistency, because what you're actually building in the early stages isn't the behavior itself. It's the identity of someone who does the behavior. Identity is where discipline actually lives. When you think of yourself as someone who exercises, the daily decision changes character. It's no longer should I work out today, it's this is what I do. The question shifts from motivation to identity maintenance. And identity maintenance is a much stronger driver than motivation, because it's tied to something people protect fiercely, their coherent sense of self. James Clear articulated this well, and it's worth sitting with. Every time you follow through on a small commitment, you cast a vote for a particular identity. Enough votes and the identity becomes real, not as a performance but as a genuine self-concept. The discipline doesn't feel like discipline anymore. It feels like being who you are. I spent years trying to build a writing habit through motivation, waiting for the days when I felt like writing, treating those days as productive and the others as lost. The output was inconsistent, and the gaps generated guilt that made the next session harder. Eventually, I stopped waiting to feel like it and started writing for 20 minutes, regardless of whether I felt like it. The quality on the unmotivated days was often indistinguishable from the quality on the motivated ones. Sometimes it was better. The motivation had been a story I was telling myself about what good work required. The action creates the motivation more reliably than the motivation creates the action. This is the reversal most people never try. There's a related principle about the value of the 5-minute rule. When you don't want to do something you've committed to, tell yourself you only have to do it for 5 minutes. This is not a trick, or rather, it is a trick, but an honest one. Sometimes you do only 5 minutes and stop, and that's fine. You maintained the identity. You kept the commitment. The streak holds. But more often than not, starting is the hardest part. And 5 minutes in, you're already doing the thing. And stopping now would require more effort than continuing. Motion generates motivation, not the other way around. Discipline also requires that you understand your own failure patterns specifically. Not generally, specifically. Not I tend to slack off, but I consistently stop following through on new habits around the 3rd week. Usually when something disrupts my routine, and I use the disruption as permission to quit rather than just restart. The disruption will come. It always does. The question is whether you've decided in advance how to treat it. A broken streak is not a failed project. It's a data point. The person who misses one day and returns the next is running a completely different program than the person who misses one day, decides the attempt is ruined, and waits for a better time to start again. Better times don't exist. They're scheduled, but they don't show up. The tracking piece is underrated, not because accountability to others matters, though it does, but because visibility matters. When discipline is invisible, it's easier to minimize. When you can see a chain of kept commitments on a calendar, the chain itself becomes a motivator. You don't want to break it. That's a feature, not a manipulation. Celebrate the small follow-throughs, not with fanfare, just with acknowledgement. You said you'd do something, and you did it. That matters. The neural pathway associated with keeping commitments to yourself gets reinforced every time you notice the follow-through. Over time, following through starts to feel like who you are rather than what you're trying to do. The goal is a life where your default mode is the behavior you'd choose on your best day. Not every day will be your best day, but the default carries you through the others. And the default is built one unremarkable, unmotivated, slightly boring follow-through at a time. Chapter 8. The loudest thing in the room is sometimes nothing. He won the negotiation by saying nothing for 11 seconds. The other side gave him $40,000 to end the silence. He told me this afterward with genuine bewilderment. He hadn't been strategic. He'd been momentarily unsure what to say next. The pause happened accidentally, but the other side interpreted it as confidence, as someone comfortable enough with his position to let the discomfort sit, and they moved first to fill it with money. He learned something that day that most people spend decades not learning. Silence has weight. And in a world where everyone is rushing to fill every gap, the person comfortable with empty space holds disproportionate power. This runs against almost everything our communication culture teaches. We reward talkers. We promote people who seem confident, which we've conflated with people who speak fluently and often. We interpret silence as uncertainty, discomfort, or social failure. We've built an entire information economy around the premise that the more you share, the more you matter. Most of this is wrong. The compulsive talker is not projecting confidence. They're managing anxiety. The need to fill silence, to respond immediately, to have an opinion ready, to keep the words coming, is almost always about discomfort with uncertainty rather than abundance of thought. It looks like authority. It functions like insecurity. Real authority is comfortable waiting. Think about the people in your life who carry genuine weight in a room. Not the loudest ones. The ones whose speaking actually changes something. They tend to say less. They tend to pause before they answer questions that deserve pausing before. They tend to let other people finish, fully finish, without the visible impatience of someone preparing their response while the other person is still talking. They are not performing calm. they have it. And the difference is immediately felt by everyone in the room, even if nobody can name exactly what they're responding to. The strategic pause in conversation does several things simultaneously. It signals that what was just said is worth thinking about, which is a form of respect. It gives your nervous system time to disengage from reactivity and engage something more deliberate. It creates a moment of uncertainty in the other person. Did that land? Are they upset? What are they thinking? That often produces more disclosure than any question you could ask. People talk into silence. They fill it. They explain themselves further, soften positions, volunteer information they hadn't planned to share. The person who asks a clear question and then waits, actually waits, without nodding encouragingly or rushing to help, will consistently receive more than the person who asks the same question and immediately starts talking again. Silence is a container. Most people never learn to hold it open long enough to see what fills it. There's a specific application in conflict that changes almost every difficult conversation it's applied to. When someone says something that triggers a defensive or emotional response, the instinct is immediate rebuttal. The urge to correct, to explain, to defend, to make sure your position is understood before theirs has even finished landing. This urge is almost always counterproductive. It escalates. It signals that you were waiting to respond rather than listening. It turns the conversation into two people managing their own anxiety rather than actually communicating. The pause, visible, deliberate, 3 to 5 seconds at minimum, does something different. It communicates that you heard, that you're taking it seriously, that you're not afraid of the challenge. Often the other person's energy drops in that pause. The aggression has nowhere to attach. They were prepared for resistance and got stillness instead, which is disorienting in the best possible way. I have watched people's entire position shift in the silence after a genuine pause. Not because I said anything particularly insightful afterward, because the pause itself communicated something they weren't expecting, that I wasn't threatened. Threatened people respond immediately. Secure people take their time. The internal version of silence is equally important and almost never discussed. Most people are not alone with their thoughts. They're alone with their noise. The internal monologue is running. The phone is nearby. The podcast is filling the commute. The television is on in the background of the evening. Genuine quiet. The kind where there's nothing incoming and you're not producing anything either, has become so rare that many people find it actively uncomfortable. This discomfort is diagnostic. It means there's something in the quiet you've been successfully avoiding, something that only surfaces when the noise stops. Most people add more noise rather than find out what it is. The people who regularly spend time in genuine silence, through meditation, through long walks without headphones, through deliberate periods of not consuming anything, consistently report clearer thinking, better emotional regulation, and more accurate self-knowledge. Not because silence is mystical, because the brain needs unstructured time to consolidate, process, and produce insight. The best ideas rarely arrive during consumption. They arrive in the gaps between it. There's a social dimension to silence that gets almost no attention. What you don't share about yourself. We live in a cultural moment that equates disclosure with authenticity and privacy with something to be suspicious of. Social media has normalized the narration of daily life in real time. The meal, the opinion, the reaction, the achievement, the struggle, all broadcast as it happens, to an audience that provides the validation that used to come from internal sources. This narration is not connection, it's management. You're curating a version of yourself for continuous external feedback, and the feedback loop, once established, starts to run the behavior. You're not living and then sharing. You're living in a way designed to be shareable, which is a different thing entirely. The psychological research on this is not subtle. Telling people about your goals before you achieve them produces a measurable reduction in motivation to achieve them. The social acknowledgement provides enough of the satisfaction that the brain deprioritizes the actual accomplishment. You get the feeling of progress without the progress. Work in silence. Let the results speak when they're ready. Not because privacy is a virtue in itself, but because the alternative fragments your attention, invites opinions you didn't ask for at a stage when they can do damage, and gives you a substitute reward that costs you the real one. The people most worth watching rarely announce what they're building until it's built. Silence also protects you from a specific social tax that most people pay without realizing it. The obligation to defend positions you stated publicly before you'd thought them through. When you share opinions, plans, and judgments immediately, before you've sat with them, before you've stress-tested them, you become attached to them. They're yours now. They're on record. Changing your mind becomes a small act of public defeat rather than a private update. So you defend them longer than they deserve, sometimes long after you've privately concluded they were wrong. Staying quiet until you're sure costs you nothing. Talking first and then retreating costs you credibility. The selective sharer is also more interesting than the constant broadcaster. Mystery is not manipulation. It's the natural result of not exhausting yourself as a subject before people have had a chance to form a genuine impression. When someone has already told you everything, there's nothing left to discover. When someone holds something back, not deceptively, just privately, the space around them carries a kind of gravity. You don't have to perform silence. You just have to stop performing noise. The discipline of the mouth that we discussed in Chapter 2 lives here as well. The pause before speaking, the choice not to engage every provocation, the resistance to gossip and complaint. These are all applications of the same underlying principle. Your words have more power when they're rationed. Your presence has more weight when it isn't constant. 11 seconds of silence once got someone $40,000. You could probably afford a few more seconds of nothing. Chapter 9. Feelings aren't facts, but they're running the meeting. Your amygdala doesn't care about your 5-year plan. It cares about right now. Specifically, it cares about whether right now contains a threat. And it has a definition of threat that was calibrated for an environment you no longer inhabit. One where the cost of missing a threat was death, which meant the system was designed to err dramatically on the side of false positives. Better to flee from 100 harmless shadows than to ignore one actual predator. That logic made sense once. Applied to a performance review, a difficult text message, or someone's tone of voice in a team meeting, it produces responses that are technically functional and practically disastrous. The body floods with cortisol. The prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for rational thought, perspective, and the kind of decision-making you'd actually endorse, goes partially offline. And you respond to a mildly uncomfortable email with the neurological equipment designed for escaping large animals. This is not a metaphor. This is the mechanism. And it runs in everyone. The people who seem emotionally intelligent are not people who have quieter amygdalae. They're people who have developed a slightly longer wire between stimulus and response. Enough space to let the initial neurological event pass before they act on it. The emotion still happens. The full biochemical experience of it still happens. They've just learned not to confuse the experience of an emotion with reliable information about reality. Feelings are data. They are not verdicts. This distinction sounds clean in theory and is genuinely difficult in practice because emotions feel true, especially the strong ones. Anger feels like justice. Fear feels like wisdom. Shame feels like accurate self-assessment. The feeling is so convincing in the moment that questioning it feels like gaslighting yourself. It isn't. It's the most important cognitive move available to you. Here's the architecture of what's actually happening. Something occurs. A comment, a look, a silence, a tone of voice. Your brain processes it in milliseconds, pattern matching against your entire history of similar experiences, and produces an emotional response before your conscious mind has had a chance to evaluate anything. The emotion arrives first. The story explaining the emotion arrives immediately after, already formed, already convincing, already presenting itself as obvious rather than constructed. The story is not neutral. It was assembled by the same system that generated the emotion, which means it's optimized to confirm the emotion rather than evaluate it. If the emotion is anxiety, the story will find evidence that things are threatening. If the emotion is anger, the story will find evidence that someone behaved wrongly. The story feels like reasoning. It's mostly post hoc justification. A man I knew received feedback from his manager that his presentation had been unclear in places. Standard professional feedback. His emotional response was shame. Immediate, full, and convincing. The story that assembled around it. He wasn't good enough for this role. People had been doubting him for months. This confirmed what he'd secretly suspected. He spent the rest of the day operating from that story. Made 3 decisions influenced by it. Avoided 2 conversations he needed to have. The feedback was about a presentation. The story turned it into a verdict about his entire professional identity. The distance between those 2 things is where emotional intelligence lives. Developing an emotional vocabulary is the first practical intervention, and it's more powerful than it sounds. Most people operate with approximately 4 emotional labels: happy, sad, angry, anxious. These categories are so broad, they provide almost no useful information. Angry covers everything from mildly irritated to genuinely furious. Sad covers disappointment, grief, loneliness, nostalgia, and despair. Using the same label for all of these prevents you from understanding what's actually happening, which prevents you from responding to it appropriately. When you can distinguish between frustrated and resentful, between nervous and terrified, between disappointed and devastated, you have access to information that's actually useful. Frustrated wants a solution. Resentful wants acknowledgement. Nervous wants preparation. Terrified wants safety. These are different needs requiring different responses. The label unlocks the appropriate intervention. Precision in emotional language is not sensitivity. It's diagnostic accuracy. The physical dimension of emotion is equally important and frequently ignored. Emotions don't just happen in the mind. They happen in the body first, and the body is often a faster reporter than conscious thought. Anger arrives as heat in the chest or tension in the jaw. Anxiety as tightness in the throat or a hollowness in the stomach. Fear as a sinking sensation or a sudden sharpening of peripheral awareness. Shame as a specific heaviness that many people couldn't describe, but would immediately recognize. Learning to notice these physical signatures early before the emotion has built enough momentum to be overwhelming, gives you an intervention point that thinking alone doesn't provide. When you can feel frustration arriving as shoulder tension, rather than waiting until it's fully assembled as an emotion, you have more options. Breathe, move, name it. Create the pause before the reaction. The body gives you the warning. Most people ignore it until the alarm is already going off. Emotional labeling, the simple act of naming what you're feeling, activates the prefrontal cortex in a measurable way. Putting a word to an emotion reduces its intensity. Not because naming it dismisses it, but because labeling it shifts your relationship to it. You move from being inside the emotion to observing it. Even partially, even briefly, that shift is enough. I'm feeling frustrated right now is a fundamentally different internal position than I am furious, and here's why everything is wrong. One describes a state, the other becomes an identity. The primary and secondary emotion distinction is worth understanding clearly. Primary emotions are the immediate, direct response to a situation. Secondary emotions are your reaction to having the primary emotion. You feel hurt. That's primary. Then you feel angry about feeling hurt, because vulnerability is uncomfortable and anger feels stronger. That's secondary. You feel anxious. That's primary. Then you feel ashamed of the anxiety, because you think you shouldn't be anxious about something this small. That's secondary. Most emotional conflicts, both internal and interpersonal, are actually happening at the secondary level. Two people are fighting about the secondary emotion while the primary one sits underneath, unaddressed and increasingly loud. The person who's angry at their partner for a minor offense is often hurt about something that happened 3 weeks ago and hasn't been acknowledged. The anger is manageable. The hurt underneath it is the conversation that actually needs to happen. Addressing secondary emotions is like treating symptoms. It provides temporary relief and leaves the cause intact. Empathy is the emotional intelligence skill most often discussed and most often misapplied. Empathy is not agreeing with someone. It's not excusing behavior. It's not absorbing someone else's emotional state as your own, which is a phenomenon called emotional contagion and is worth actively resisting rather than cultivating. Empathy is the cognitive act of genuinely considering what another person's experience might be from inside their situation, with their history, their fears, their context. This is harder than it sounds, because your own emotional state is always louder than your imagination of someone else's. When you're triggered, your experience crowds out your capacity for perspective. The person who just said something that hurt you does not, in that moment, feel like someone with their own pressures and fears and reasons. They feel like someone who said something that hurt you. That's all they are, in that moment, to the emotion. The pause, again, always the pause, is what creates the space to ask what might be happening for them. Not to excuse what they said, not to absorb the blame, just to widen the frame enough that your response is to a full human being rather than to a stimulus. Responses to full human beings tend to go better than responses to stimuli. Emotional contagion is the piece of emotional intelligence that nobody teaches because it requires you to take responsibility for something that feels like it's happening to you. You are broadcasting your emotional state continuously. Your body language, your tone, your micro-expressions, the pace of your speech, all of it is transmitting information that other people's nervous systems are receiving and mirroring, often without conscious awareness. Walk into a room angry, and you have introduced anger into that room's atmosphere. Walk in calm, and you have introduced something else. You cannot opt out of this transmission. You can only become more deliberate about what you're sending, which means mood management, the previous chapter, is not just about your own well-being. It's about the emotional environment you're creating for everyone who spends time near you. Your children, your colleagues, your partner. They are all, to varying degrees, running on the emotional weather you produce. That's either a burden or a responsibility, depending on how you choose to hold it. The goal is not emotional flatness, not the carefully managed neutrality of someone who has suppressed everything inconvenient. The goal is range with stability, the ability to feel everything fully while retaining enough center that the feeling doesn't make decisions for you. Emotions are the most vivid part of being human. They're also the most expensive when unmanaged. The meeting is always running. The only question is, who's actually in charge of it? Chapter 10. You live inside a machine you designed. The cookie wasn't the problem. The fact that it was on the counter was the problem. Nobody sits down and consciously decides to eat a cookie they didn't plan to eat. They walk past the counter, the cookie is there, the hand moves before the decision does, and somewhere between the kitchen and the couch, the cookie is gone, and a small background process of mild self-criticism has begun. Then the person concludes they lack discipline around food. They don't lack discipline around food. They lack a counter without cookies on it. This sounds almost insultingly simple. It is. The simplicity is the point. Because most people are expending enormous amounts of cognitive and emotional energy fighting their environment rather than designing it, white-knuckling through situations that a 5-minute rearrangement would have made irrelevant. Your environment is not neutral. It is constantly, silently running behavioral code. The arrangement of your physical space, the people you're regularly exposed to, the information you consume by default, the digital landscape you navigate, all of it is shaping your thoughts, emotions, and decisions in ways that operate largely beneath your awareness. You didn't design most of it. It assembled around you. And it's running the show more than you think. The research on environmental influence on behavior is one of the most consistently replicated bodies of findings in behavioral science. People eat more when plates are larger. They drink more when glasses are taller and narrower. They exercise more when gym clothes are visible. They save more when savings are automatic. They read more when books are within reach. They scroll more when phones are within reach. The behavior follows the environment with a reliability that should be both humbling and actionable. Humbling because it reveals how much of what you call choice is actually just response to cues. Actionable because cues can be changed. The concept is sometimes called choice architecture. You're not eliminating choices. You're arranging them so the better ones require less effort and the worse ones require more. You're engineering friction into the behaviors you want less of and removing friction from the behaviors you want more of. This is not manipulation. This is design. And the only question is whether you're doing it deliberately or letting it happen by default. Your physical environment is the most immediately changeable and the one most people ignore entirely. The workspace that's cluttered and disorganized is not just aesthetically unpleasant, it's cognitively taxing. Every item that doesn't belong in your visual field is a small draw on your attention. A micro decision about whether to address it that your brain makes and discards dozens of times a day without telling you. The cumulative cost is focus. The cumulative cost of focus is the quality of your thinking. A clear workspace is not about tidiness as virtue. It's about removing ambient cognitive load so the attention you have is available for what actually matters. Design your physical space for the person you're trying to be, not the person you've been. If the person you're trying to be exercises in the morning, the shoes are by the door the night before. If the person you're trying to be reads instead of scrolling, the book is on the pillow and the phone is charging in another room. If the person you're trying to be eats better, the kitchen contains what that person eats. These are not dramatic changes. They're small physical reconfigurations that remove the negotiation from the moment. The moment is a terrible time to negotiate with yourself. You're tired or hungry, or depleted from a full day of decisions, and the environment is offering you the path of least resistance. Make the path of least resistance the right one, and the moment takes care of itself. The social environment is harder to redesign and more important than the physical one. You are not as autonomous as you believe. Your attitudes, your ambitions, your risk tolerance, your financial habits, your health behaviors, all of these are measurably influenced by the people you spend the most time with. Not because you're weak or impressionable, because humans are social animals and social calibration is a deep biological function. You unconsciously adjust your sense of normal to match the people around you. This works beautifully when the people around you are operating at a level you want to reach. It works against you when they're not. The people closest to you are either a tailwind or a tax. Not because of their character, most people are genuinely good, but because of their defaults, their default conversation topics, their default relationship with effort and ambition, their default response to your attempts to change. Some people in your life will celebrate your growth because it doesn't threaten anything in them. Others will, with complete unconsciousness and no malice, subtly discourage it. Because your growth requires them to update their model of who you are, and possibly their model of who they are by comparison. A woman spent 3 years trying to change her financial habits while living with a partner whose relationship with money was the opposite of everything she was trying to build. Every conversation about saving became a negotiation. Every small victory was absorbed into a shared lifestyle that hadn't changed. She wasn't failing at discipline. She was swimming against a current she'd chosen to live in. She eventually had a direct conversation about shared financial values that she'd been avoiding for 2 years. Things shifted. Not immediately, but the environment shifted, which meant her behavior could shift without the constant expenditure of will. The conversation you're avoiding is often the environmental change you need most. Auditing your social circle is not a cold calculation about people's worth. It's an honest assessment of what daily exposure to certain people is actually doing to your thinking, your energy, and your sense of what's possible. You can love someone and also recognize that spending significant time with them consistently leaves you more negative, more limited, or more exhausted than you were before. You don't have to cut people out. You can adjust the dosage. Your information environment operates the same way and gets almost no deliberate attention. What you consume mentally becomes the furniture of your mind. Not in some vague inspirational sense, literally. The concepts, framings, narratives, and emotional tones you're regularly exposed to shape the lens through which you interpret everything else. A steady diet of outrage-optimized news doesn't just inform you about bad things happening. It recalibrates your baseline sense of how threatening the world is, how trustworthy other people are, and how much agency you have over your own circumstances. This is not an argument for ignorance. It's an argument for intentionality. The difference between consuming news to understand the world and consuming news because the algorithm has learned what keeps you engaged is the difference between nutrition and addiction. Both involve food. Only one is feeding you. Only Be at least as deliberate about your information diet as you are about your actual diet. Probably more deliberate, since the effects of information consumption on your thinking and mood are less visible than the effects of food on your body. The digital environment deserves its own honest accounting. Your phone is not a neutral tool. It's a surface covered in carefully engineered triggers, each one designed by teams of behavioral scientists to capture and hold your attention as efficiently as possible. Every notification is a variable reward. Every infinite scroll is a slot machine. Every like is a dopamine microdose calibrated to make you return. You are not weak for being affected by this. You are human, and the systems were built specifically to exploit human psychology. But knowing the mechanism should change how you relate to it. Designing your digital environment means making conscious decisions about what lives on your phone's home screen, when notifications are allowed, what apps are installed at all. It means creating friction between you and the things you want to do less of. Move the social media app off the home screen, not delete it. Just make it require 2 extra taps. That 2-tap friction is enough to interrupt the automatic reach, which is enough to create the pause where a choice can happen. I reorganized my phone so the first screen contained only tools, and the second screen contained everything else. The reflex reach still happened, but it landed on a calculator and a notes app, which are difficult to get lost in. The behavioral change was almost immediate, not because I suddenly had more willpower, because the environment stopped cooperating with the behavior I was trying to reduce. Finally, your temporal environment, the structure of your time, is as much an environment as your physical space. How your day is sequenced determines what has access to your best cognitive resources. Hard decisions made early. Deep work protected from interruption. Recovery built in before depletion becomes dysfunction. Social and emotional demands scheduled at times when you have enough left to handle them well. Most people's days are structured by other people's urgency. The inbox determines the morning. The meeting request determines the afternoon. The notification determines the moment. This is not a schedule. It's a series of responses to external demands, with your own priorities fitted into whatever gaps remain. The gaps are usually too small and too depleted for the work that actually matters. Design the day before the day designs itself. Put your most important work in your best hours. Protect that time the way you'd protect a meeting with someone you can't cancel on. Because the person you're protecting it for is the version of you that the rest of your life depends on. You live inside a machine. You built most of it without realizing you were building anything. You can rebuild it, deliberately, piece by piece. The results will look from the outside like discipline. From the inside, they'll feel like ease. Chapter 11, Small is not slow. A 1% improvement feels like nothing. Compounded daily for a year, it's a 37 times difference. Nobody believes this until it's already happened to them. This is the most important mathematical fact in personal development and the least felt. Because the feeling of 1% improvement is, experientially, indistinguishable from the feeling of no improvement at all. The gap between who you are today and who you'll be after one genuinely better day is not perceptible. It doesn't register. You go to sleep roughly the same person you woke up as, and nothing in your experience contradicts that assessment. This is why people quit. Not because the method doesn't work, because the method doesn't feel like it's working. And in a culture engineered around immediate feedback, where every action produces a visible response, where progress is expected to be legible and fast, the compound effect is almost cosmically counterintuitive. It asks you to trust a process whose results are, for a long time, invisible. Most people won't do that. They'll switch methods before the current one has had time to produce evidence. They'll escalate intensity when consistency was the actual requirement. They'll conclude that small changes don't work, having never stayed with them long enough to find out. The compound effect doesn't care about your impatience. It runs anyway. The question is only whether it's running for you or against you. Here's the uncomfortable symmetry. The same mathematics that turns small positive habits into large positive outcomes also turns small negative habits into large negative ones. The daily cigarette, the nightly glass that became 2, the chronic lateness, the small financial decision made slightly carelessly, repeated across years. None of these feel catastrophic in the moment. Compounded across a decade, they are. Most life outcomes, good and bad, are the result of processes that were invisible until they weren't. The bankruptcy that seemed sudden had been building for years in small decisions. The extraordinary physical health that seemed genetic was built in unremarkable daily choices across decades. The marriage that seemed to collapse without warning had been eroding in small moments of disconnection, each one too minor to address, accumulated into distance. We attribute outcomes to events because events are visible. The process is usually where the real story is. A man I knew couldn't identify when his health had deteriorated. There was no single moment, no dramatic turning point, no clear before and after. There was just a long sequence of unremarkable choices. The skipped workout, the fast food option, the extra hour of sleep traded for the early morning walk. Each one negligible, each one compounding quietly until the body presented a bill that felt sudden and wasn't. He kept looking for the event that had caused it. The cause was the absence of events, the missing daily deposits. Negative compounding doesn't require action. It requires only the sustained absence of the right action. This reframes what consistency actually means. Consistency is not doing something every single day without exception. That's a performance of consistency that tends to collapse under the first genuine disruption and take the habit with it. Consistency is the pattern held over time, the return after the miss, the restart after the break, the refusal to let a temporary lapse become a permanent exit. The streaks matter less than the trajectory. A person who maintains a behavior 80% of the time across 2 years has done something more substantial than a person who maintained it perfectly for 6 weeks and then quit. The math is obvious. The psychology runs the other direction, because the broken streak feels like failure, and failure feels like information about whether to continue. It isn't information about whether to continue. It's information about what disrupts you, which is useful, which you can use to design better. The specific application across the 4 pillars is worth making concrete. For mouth control, the compound effect means that every single pause before speaking is depositing something. Not into the specific conversation, the individual pause is invisible. Into the neural pathway that makes pausing easier next time. Into the relationship with the person you didn't snap at. Into your own self-concept as someone who chooses words deliberately. These deposits are microscopic. Over a year of consistent practice, the person who was reactive is genuinely, measurably different. Not because of any single moment, but because of the accumulated weight of all of them. For mind control, every cognitive reframe you practice, every time you catch a catastrophic thought and redirect it towards something more accurate, is a small structural change in how your brain processes threat. The neuroscience here is not metaphorical. Neural pathways strengthen with use. The pessimistic spiral that used to take 40 minutes to develop starts taking 20, then 10, then you catch it in the first few seconds before it's built any momentum. That's not inspiration. That's repeated small practice producing structural change. For mood control, the compound effect is most immediately felt in relationships. Every time you manage your emotional state before entering a room, every time you choose your response rather than your reaction, you're depositing into a relational account that pays dividends over years. People don't consciously track whether you're emotionally regulated. They track, at a felt level, whether they feel better or worse after spending time with you. That felt sense accumulates into something that determines how much access people give you to their trust, their honesty, and their goodwill. For money, the compound effect is the most mathematically literal and the most emotionally resisted. The $25 a week that feels pointless is not pointless. The automatic savings transfer that seems too small to matter is not too small to matter. The decision to pay down high-interest debt before buying the thing you want is not a sacrifice. It's a trade that returns many times its value over time. The resistance to small financial actions is almost always psychological rather than practical. It's the feeling that the amount is too small to be serious, that the gap between where you are and where you want to be is too large for small steps to bridge, that the effort of discipline doesn't justify the insignificant reward. These feelings are wrong, and they're expensive. Start smaller than feels necessary. This is a genuine recommendation, not a hedge. The brain resists change proportional to the size of the change requested. Ask for a large change, and it mobilizes resistance. Ask for a change so small it seems trivial, and the resistance doesn't activate. The small change gets through. It takes root. It becomes part of the pattern. Then you can ask for slightly more. This is not timidity. This is how change actually works in a nervous system that's optimized for stability. You're not sneaking past the resistance. You're making a genuine request that the system can accommodate without threat. The problem with dramatic transformations, the total overhaul, the complete reset, the January 1st everything changes plan, is not ambition. Ambition is fine. The problem is that dramatic change asks the entire system to reorganize at once, which is exactly what the system is designed to prevent. The backlash is proportional to the request. Ask for everything at once, and you'll get resistance proportional to everything. Ask for one small thing, consistently, and the system has no strong objection. There's a tracking piece that matters not for accountability to others, but for making the invisible visible to yourself. The compound effect is psychologically difficult to sustain precisely because early progress is imperceptible. You need some way to see it. Not because the results aren't happening, they are. But because human motivation responds to visible progress and atrophies without it. A simple record of daily follow-through, a check on a calendar, a number in a notebook, a streak in an app, provides the visibility that the results themselves aren't yet providing. You're not tracking to prove something. You're tracking to sustain something through the period when the math is working, but the evidence hasn't arrived yet. The evidence always arrives, eventually. And when it does, it tends to arrive all at once. Not because the change was sudden, but because the threshold of perceptibility was finally crossed. One day you notice that the spiral takes 10 seconds instead of 40. One day you notice that the conversation that used to end in conflict ended differently. One day you look at an account balance and the number is not what you expected. The compound effect revealing itself feels like a sudden change. It was never sudden. It was always accumulation. Patient, unremarkable, slightly boring accumulation. The most powerful force available to you operates on a timescale your emotions resist and your intellect can accept. Choose which one you're going to listen to. Chapter 12. The Voice That Won't Shut Up. The harshest critic in your life doesn't have a face. It has your voice. And it has been talking for so long, in such a familiar tone, that most people have stopped noticing it's there. It's become atmospheric, background radiation. The constant low-level commentary that narrates performance, predicts outcomes, assigns meaning to other people's silences, and delivers verdicts about your worth with the calm certainty of someone who has access to information they definitely don't have. You wouldn't tolerate this from another person for 20 minutes. From yourself, you've tolerated it for decades. This is not a small thing. The internal monologue is the most influential conversation in your life. It shapes what you attempt, what you avoid, how you interpret what happens to you, and what you conclude about what's possible. Every external relationship you have is filtered through it. Every opportunity that arrives gets evaluated by it first. Every setback runs through its particular interpretive machinery and comes out the other side as either information or verdict. Most people's inner voice delivers verdicts. Here's how it got there. The internal monologue is not original. It was assembled from external voices, parents, teachers, early peers, significant experiences that got internalized over time and converted from something heard to something believed. The parent who expressed frustration with your performance didn't intend to install a permanent inner critic. The teacher who said you weren't a math person didn't know they were authoring a limitation you'd carry for 30 years. The early experience of failing publicly didn't mean to become the template against which you'd measure every subsequent attempt. None of it was deliberate installation, but it all got installed. And the installed version runs with a conviction that the original sources never had. Because when a belief goes internal, it stops feeling like someone else's opinion and starts feeling like your own perception of reality. You're not repeating what your father said about your potential. You're just seeing clearly. You're not echoing the cultural message about what people like you achieve. You're just being realistic. Realistic is the word the inner critic uses when it wants to sound like wisdom. The first move is identification. Not analysis, not excavation of every childhood origin. Just the basic act of noticing the voice is there. Noticing what it's saying, and registering that what it's saying is a perspective rather than a fact. This is genuinely harder than it sounds, because the voice is fast. By the time you've registered that something happened, the interpretation is already running. The colleague didn't respond to your message. The voice has already produced a story about what that means, and the story already has emotional weather attached to it. The presentation went slightly off track. The voice has already written the review, and it's not favorable. You're living in the aftermath of interpretations you never consciously chose. Developing the observer position, the capacity to watch your own thinking from a slight remove, is the foundational skill here. Not detachment, not dissociation, just enough distance to register. There's a thought happening. It has a particular character. It's saying a particular thing. Is that thing true? The question is not rhetorical. It requires an actual answer, which requires actual evidence, which is something the inner critic almost never provides, because it doesn't need to. It has emotional force instead. And emotional force in the moment feels exactly like evidence. When you ask the voice to show its work, it usually can't. I went through a period of genuinely believing I was less capable than most of the people I worked alongside. Not dramatically, just a persistent, quiet sense of operating slightly below the level the situation required. Then someone asked me to list the specific evidence for that belief. I sat with it for a while. The evidence was almost entirely composed of moments where I'd felt uncertain, which I'd been interpreting as proof of inadequacy, rather than as the normal experience of doing something that mattered and wasn't guaranteed to go well. Uncertainty is not incompetence. The voice had been conflating them for years. The language patterns of the inner critic follow predictable forms that are worth knowing, because once you can name the pattern, you can interrupt it. Catastrophizing converts uncertainty into certainty about the worst outcome. Something might go wrong becomes something will go wrong, becomes something has already effectively gone wrong. And here's what that means about the future. The escalation happens in seconds and feels like logical progression. It isn't. It's anxiety generating narrative momentum. Overgeneralization takes a single data point and builds a law from it. You handled one conversation badly, and the voice concludes you're bad at difficult conversations. You missed a financial target once, and the voice concludes you're bad with money. The single instance gets promoted to permanent characteristic without any acknowledgement of the sample size problem. Personalization assigns causation to you that belongs elsewhere. Someone is in a bad mood, and the voice asks what you did to cause it. A project doesn't go as planned, and the voice skips past the dozen variables that contributed and lands directly on your failure as the explanation. Mind reading decides it knows what other people think, specifically what they think about you, without any actual data. And the verdict is always unfavorable. The mind reader's inner voice has never once concluded that someone was thinking something generous. Labeling is the most corrosive pattern. It converts behaviors into identities. You didn't just make a mistake. You're someone who makes that kind of mistake. You didn't just struggle with something. You're someone who struggles with that thing. The label collapses the distance between an incident and a permanent characteristic. And once something is a characteristic, it stops being something you can address and becomes something you simply are. Catching these patterns requires a specific kind of self-observation that is neither self-criticism nor self-protection. Both of those are too emotionally charged to be useful. What's needed is something closer to clinical curiosity, the stance of someone genuinely interested in what's happening, without a stake in the verdict. The reframe is not the replacement of negative thoughts with positive ones. That's just installing a different automated response. The reframe is the movement from verdict to position, from I'm not good enough to I haven't developed this skill yet, from I always do this to I did this today, and I can understand why and do something different tomorrow. From this will never work to this hasn't worked yet, and here's what I might adjust. The language shift is small. The psychological shift is substantial. Verdict closes. Position opens. Closed thinking produces stasis. Open thinking produces movement. Self-compassion is the piece most people resist because it sounds soft and because their inner critic has convinced them that harshness is what keeps them honest. The belief is that without the internal pressure, the constant evaluation, the relentless standard, the voice that reminds you of your failures, you'd become complacent, mediocre, someone who makes peace with inadequacy. This belief is not just wrong, it's precisely backwards. The research on self-compassion versus self-criticism as motivational tools is not ambiguous. Self-criticism activates the threat response. The threat response narrows thinking, reduces creativity, and produces avoidance behavior. You don't try things you might fail at when the internal penalty for failure is that severe. You don't take the risks that growth requires when the inner verdict for falling short is humiliation. Self-compassion, the willingness to treat yourself with the same basic decency you'd extend to someone you care about, activates a completely different system, one associated with safety, exploration, and the kind of psychological security that makes genuine effort possible. You try more. You recover faster. You learn instead of defending. The harsh inner voice doesn't produce excellence. It produces anxiety and avoidance wearing excellence as a disguise. There's a specific practice worth building into the structure of your days. Not long, not complex. At the beginning of the day, before the inner critic has had a chance to review yesterday's performance and set the tone, direct the internal voice deliberately. Give it something to say that's accurate, useful, and oriented toward what you're building rather than what you failed at. Not affirmations in the sense of statements you don't believe, repeated until belief arrives. Specific, honest acknowledgments of what's true and useful. I handled that difficult situation better than I would have a year ago. I'm building something that matters, and it takes time. I've been wrong before and updated, which means I'm capable of learning. These are not consolations. They're accurate statements that the inner critic, left to its own defaults, would never generate because they don't serve its primary function, which is threat detection, not truth. At the end of the day, the same deliberateness. Not a review of everything that went wrong. The inner critic will handle that unprompted. A specific inventory of what you did that was consistent with the person you're trying to be. Small things count. They count more than the inner critic wants you to believe. The voice won't shut up. That was never the goal. The goal is to stop letting it be the only voice in the room. You already knew most of this. That's the uncomfortable part. Not the details, not every framework or distinction, but the shape of it. The idea that your mouth causes damage you didn't intend, that your mind runs stories you didn't write, that your mood is more manufactured than received, that your money goes where your psychology sends it. None of this is genuinely surprising. You felt the evidence of all of it. Probably recently. Knowing hasn't been the problem. The gap between knowing and doing is not an intelligence problem. It's not a motivation problem exactly. It's a decision problem. Specifically, the decision to stop waiting for better conditions, more readiness, a cleaner starting point. The conditions will not improve on their own. The readiness is a feeling that follows action, not one that precedes it. You start where you are, with what you have, as who you are right now, not the future version who has already figured this out. That person is built from this one. One unremarkable choice at a time. The 4 pillars don't require perfection. They require direction. A consistent lean toward deliberateness in your words, your thoughts, your emotional responses, your financial decisions, that compounds quietly into something unrecognizable from where you began. Nothing dramatic happens first. Something real happens eventually. The only question is when you decide eventually starts.